My name is Pat Engelhard, and I've been living in Hilo for about 50 years, but I was born on the island of Kauai. And my family has been in Hawaii I'm the fifth generation, since the 1840s on one side and the 1860s on the other side. I started working at Lyman Museum in 1993. I started working as a trustee at the museum, which is like on the board of directors. But I started working as a docent in 2009 after I graduated. After I retired in 2008. And so I've been a docent for 8 years now. And I tell the story about the Lymans by starting with the fact that there was a young man named Henry Opukaha'ia who was born in the Ka'u district of this island and was living in the village of Napopo after his family was all killed during the wars when Kamehameha was uniting the islands. These wars went on for many years. But eventually the islands were all united. And Henry went to live with his uncle, who was a kahuna, which is the priestly order of the kapu system, the old Hawaiian religious system, which had lots of gods, lots of heiau, which are temples where they worshipped. And he was learning to be a kahuna. One day he decided he didn't particularly like that, so he convinced a captain of a ship that had sailed into Kealakekua Bay to take him on as a cabin boy. And he ended up sailing all over the Pacific Basin, went to China, Aleutians, Pacific Northwest, and came back to Hawaii, picked up 4 other Hawaiian young men, and all of them went back to Connecticut and to New York with the captain. Henry was introduced to Christianity on the way, but he really picked it up when he got to Connecticut, and because there was a big missionary group there. And so he wanted to be the first of his people to bring Christianity back to Hawaii. So he was going to missionary schools to learn to do this, to lead the mission. He also went to Yale as one of the schools that he went to missionaries to learn to be a missionary. He died of typhus in 1818. It struck him really fast, really hard. The Hawaiians had absolutely no immunity because they hadn't been exposed to any of the foreign diseases. An interesting thing about diseases in Hawaii was that they estimated that when Captain Cook came to Hawaii in 1778, there were between 500,000 and 1 million Hawaiians, probably more like 500,000. But by the time Queen Liliuokalani, who was the last monarch of the dynasty, or the monarchy, died, there were 34,000 Hawaiians. They all just died so fast because of introduced diseases from sailors, foreigners. Anyway, Henry had no resistance. He died very quickly. He was 26 years old when he died. The people with whom he was studying were very impressed by his piety and his desire to learn as much as he could, as fast as he could, so he could come back to Hawaii to bring the missionary story. And so they encouraged the American Board of Commissioners to go ahead with the idea of doing the mission to Hawaii, even though they didn't have a head missionary. They did eventually have someone who took over for the group in 1820 when they first got here. After they got here, there were 12 groups that came to Hawaii from the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions. The Lymans, came to Hawaii in 1832, and they first came to, I think, Oahu, and then they came here. So they were preaching at a church which held approximately 2,000 people down by Opukaha'ia, which is a section of Hilo. And they had several churches before they finally ended up at Hilo Church, which is right down the street from us. But they were all thatched and did not last for very long, even though they held a lot of people. So the Lyman's house was built in 1839, 7 years after they got here. And the house that you see started out to be thatched. The roof was thatched, although the entire ground floor was made of koa. And then in 1845, they added on Reverend Lyman's office and barter room, which were an extension to the house. And in 1856, they raised the roof, added on 4 bedrooms upstairs, and put on a metal roof. The house that was built in 1858 is the house as it exists today, 178 years old. And it is the oldest frame house on this island. Okay, before the Lymans built the house, the Reverend Lyman had started the Hilo boarding school in 1836 to educate young Hawaiian men to become missionaries. From the Hilo boarding school, they went on to Lahaina Luna Seminary on the island of Maui, and they then graduated into being ministers for their people. But under Reverend Lyman's grandson, Levi Lyman, they expanded the trade school idea of the educational system that they'd started, and got rid of the idea that you had to be a missionary to come here, because by that time the immigrant groups had moved into Hawaii to work in the sugar industry. So there were a lot of different nationalities of young men that came to the trade school. And they learned trades such as being blacksmiths, furniture makers, bookbinders and printers. Well, the thing that they're most famous for is making koa furniture. And they had a teacher from Japan who taught mostly Japanese young men, but others also. And they continued doing that until 1927, when the furniture factory burned down. The machines probably came from the U.S., the United States, yeah. The teachers came from the United States, if they even brought any, because most of the time they had people here who had come over as teachers, as missionary teachers, or were able to teach the fundamental things, like being a blacksmith was not that difficult to learn. A lot of the people who came over to work in the sugar industry knew how to be blacksmiths. They came over because they had to build mills, and you needed to be able to work with metals. And so Scottish people came over. The Hamakua Coast, which you may or may not have heard of, was called Scotch Coast because there were so many Scotchmen that lived there. And a lot of them were blacksmiths. So that's how how they were able to educate young men to continue with that trade. By the time the Big Five really got to be Big Five, there were not that many missionaries. Their kids were part of that movement, the movement to make sugar big. But the missionaries were were sent here in 1820, but by the 1840s or 50s, they weren't supported by the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions anymore. They were, all the things that they sent them to trade with were discontinued. They didn't have the money anymore from the United States. So the American Board of Commissioners told them, you can either stay here and make it on your own, and a lot of them did as teachers, or as ministers, obviously, or you can come home. So a lot of them went home, but many of them stayed. And so by the time 1860s is when sugar really started getting big, because that was when they came up with what they call the Reciprocity Treaty, where the United States would not charge them tariffs to send sugar to the mainland. So that's when sugar really started to get big. And so the missionaries themselves were not all that active in the Big Five, but their children were. And they're the ones who felt that it was necessary to overthrow the monarchy, because they weren't being able to expand the sugar industry as fast as they wanted to, I think. Okay. The Hawaiian dress are for women anyway. They would just get a big kapa or tapa cloth, which was made by beating the inside bark of a mulberry tree. They just beat them together into sheets of kapa, and it kept on being beaten until they got to the right thickness, whatever thickness they wanted. And they decorated them, but they just wrapped them around themselves and tied them. So their upper bodies were exposed, and the missionaries did not like that. They thought they should be covered. So that was one of the main things that the Hawaiian women, after they converted to Christianity, which was really fast, they converted to Christianity quickly, because Kamehameha I had the kapu system. His son, Kamehameha II, didn't really like it that much. The kapu system was very restrictive. Women couldn't eat with men. Women couldn't eat certain foods. And Ka'ahumanu, who was King Kamehameha's favorite wife, she thought that was very unfair. Here I am, Ka'ahumanu, saying, I go out and I fight wars with this man, and he won't even let me eat with him. So when he died, she had to become the regent because Kamehameha II was too young. So she banned the kapu system. And this was shortly after Kamehameha died and shortly before the missionaries arrived. So there was a space of maybe a year, not even a year, where there was no organized religion in Hawaii. And the people were just, they were so indoctrinated to the kapu system that they didn't have anything. They tore down the temples, they tore out the gods that they worshipped, and so they were at a loss. So when the missionaries arrived, they were ready. They needed to have some kind of a system, a religious system, and they converted to Christianity so quickly. And one of the things that the missionaries were responsible for doing was translating the Bible from not English to Hawaiian, but Hebrew and Greek and Aramaic to Hawaiian. And so the Hawaiians are said to have one of the best Bibles based on it's not the King James version. It is not. It's based on Hebrew. Hebrew version, right? Because the missionaries that trained to come here were trained in Hebrew, Greek, Aramaic. in Andover Theological Seminary. They had a teacher who translated directly from those books. It's a pretty amazing story. Anyway, they completed their translation in 1838, and it's the same translation today. The only thing they've done to it is put in the diacritical markings, the ukinas and the kahakos and the things that tell you how to pronounce the word. That's the only thing they've changed. Anyway, they translated this Bible, and they had 900 schools, a school being any place where people learned anything. They were the most literate nation in the world for a decade or so, because everybody wanted to learn to read the Bible, because they just accepted Christianity so quickly. The women wanted to be good Christians, and so they were willing to wear these mu'umu'us, or Mother Hubbards, which is what the New Englanders call them. So they learned to stitch clothing so that they could cover themselves. But prior to the missionaries coming, they were pretty free and easy. Kapa is Hawaiian, Tapa is Tahitian, but a lot of the second migration of Hawaiians came from Tahiti.
Second migration.
Yeah, and the first migration came from elsewhere in Micronesia. Marquesas, yes. Name anyway. And tea is very common in it's part of Tahitian language. So they called it tapa for a long time, but now that they're trying to get the Hawaiian language reinstalled, they're calling it by its real name, which was kapa. Well, the missionaries were the ones who brought the printing press, which is how they were able to print the Bible. That's what they wanted to do the most. They wanted to get the Bible printed. Both the missionaries and the Hawaiians wanted to get the Bible printed. After that, then they were able to translate the Hawaiian stories, hymns, legends, all the things that were verbally passed down over the centuries. The Kumulipo, which is the Hawaiian version of Genesis for our Bible. All of those things were written afterwards. But the first thing they wanted to do was to get a Bible translated and printed. If you ever see old pictures like Hawai'i, Owaihi, so it's spelled Owhyyee, was how they said Hawaii. So that's how the missionaries or other English-speaking people translated the Hawaiian. So the missionaries took it upon themselves to learn Hawaiian as best they could. I'm getting back to the Bible. There were 3 or 4 different brands of Hawaiian. If you were a maka'ainana, which is a lower level person, you spoke a certain language to the people that you talked to. If you were a chief, you spoke a different kind of Hawaiian. If you were a king or ali'i, you spoke a higher level. When they translated the Bible, they translated it into ali'i speak, so to speak. So they did the best they could with the translation of the Bible. And they did that by getting 3 or 4 ali'i speakers. If you've seemed to be fairly up on things. If you ever heard of a man named David Mahalo, he was the only one who was a commoner of the people that helped to translate the Bible. but they had 3 other Ali'i blood who helped the missionaries translate the Bible. So the missionaries would say, this is what the Bible says. And then the Ali'i speakers would say, okay, this is the best way to say it so that everybody understands it. And they would just go back and forth until they got it right. But that's basically how the English, the Hawaiians learned. The English-speaking people spoke Hawaiian as best they could to get it across. It wasn't so much Hawaiians learning English until later on. It was more the English trying to get the Hawaiian right. When they wanted to reintroduce the Hawaiian language because they didn't speak it for many, many decades. And then there started to be a group of people who thought that it was time for the Hawaiian Renaissance. So that was in the 70s. So that music and everything started at the same time. It just kind of started happening, and they then started speaking a very standardized method of Hawaiian. The Ukinas were the same. They taught the same way, so that if you were talking to a Southerner, you would have a different twang to your English. Or if you were talking to somebody from the Midwest, they sound different. Somebody from Maine sounds different. But the teaching that they are doing now in the schools is all the same. So some Hawaiians think it should. The older Hawaiians like to be able to differentiate between somebody who speaks Hawaiian from Kauai or Kauai, as a lot of people call it, or from Oahu. They all have a slightly different way of speaking Hawaiian. But if you're part of the university system, or if you're part of teaching the youngsters today how to speak Hawaiian, they have Hawaiian immersion schools. They all speak it the same way. So there's not much of a variation in the Hawaiian. That's a good question. I think it is probably, if I had to guess, and I'm not sure, you could check with the university. I'm thinking it's probably Chief Ali'i, and between Chief and the nobility level, they try to speak as well as they can.
Yeah, that would have the best documentation, it appears,
Mm-hmm.
of the missionaries' work.
Yeah.
Are you familiar with any work that may be available of the common Hawaiian that
until I was learning about this Bible translation, I never even knew there were 3 different kinds.
This is the first time.
Yeah, I never knew that. And I think that David Mahalo might have something that he may have written, because he was able to converse easily with everybody, being from the Maka'inana group of people, which was commoners. Their own thing. No, they were all under the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions, and they had although they landed in Kona first, they ended up on Oahu, and that was their. Well, sometimes Lahaina was their capital, or so to speak, for a while, but mostly Oahu. Oahu was the place where the ships would land. They would all come together, and they had conferences of missionaries, learn things, got their trade goods that I was talking about in the mission house. They got their trade goods, and they'd go back to their places. They were fairly controlled as to how they could say it, and so many of them were educated at the same place, Andover Theological Seminary. So they all pretty much and they were all Congregationalists at first, so they all had the same method of teaching. And they were controlled to some degree by Honolulu, and I think his name was Levi Chamberlain, but I'm not sure. No, actually, what happens is you learn something, and then that makes even more questions. The thing that's interesting to me, and if people ever start talking to me about Hawaiian history, I say the thing that you need to understand is that everything that happened to the Hawaiians happened in the course of about 150 years. Everybody else got 1,000 years to absorb all the things that were happening and to just get ready for it and to work their way into it. And it was just pounded into the Hawaiians so quickly, plus the fact that they died so fast. The reason, people have told me that the reason Bernice Pauahi Bishop had such a huge estate with which to educate the Hawaiians at Kamehameha schools, one of the reasons that Bernice Pauahi Bishop had such a huge estate when she died, and she was able to start what then became Kamehameha schools later, because that was her intent, to educate Hawaiian children. And her estate was so huge was because her relatives passed all this land to her because they died so quickly. And she was able to amass, the Kamehameha School's Bishop Estate is or was the largest nonprofit organization in the United States. And it was huge. And it still is very large. I don't know if it's the biggest now, but it used to be. Everything is going just as fast, but the whole world is going just as fast. So I don't think it's going to be any harder on the Hawaiians than it is now. I know that there are a lot of Hawaiians that would like to see Hawaiian become the official language, so that the court system and everything else is done in Hawaiian. But I think it's going to be kind of difficult because there's so many people who speak English that live here and are not particularly going to learn Hawaiian. But there are a whole lot of Hawaiian immersion schools where children speak nothing but Hawaiian. Lots of them. Ooh, that's a toughie. I don't know. I don't know how easy it would be. And it has to happen fairly easily for everybody to accept it. I think the Hawaiian people will accept it fairly quickly because they're living in it. But there are people who are coming from everywhere in the world to live here, and I'm not sure how quickly that would happen. But there was, especially when the Hawaiian Renaissance first started, there was talk about having everything be in Hawaiian. And especially, to me, the most difficult and why it stuck in my mind was the court system. So people would have a jury, and it would be in Hawaiian. They would come up with their verdicts and convictions in Hawaiian, and that's going to be hard. But we'll see. Well, you mean to become the sovereignty issue again?
Yes.
I think that's another really tough one. There are people who believe that it can be done. There are probably 20 or 30 different groups of Hawaiians that would like to see it. Each of them has their own idea about what's right. I think that there can be a way to have both, but I don't think that they can ever go back to completely the monarchy, completely living under the monarchy. They can have, because the Hawaiian land system has fee simple, and they have crown lands, and so The Crown lands are being held by the state of Hawaii because of the possibility that the monarchy could be reinstated. But, and then there's the Office of Hawaiian Affairs that also speaks up about things like that. And they get a percentage of the Crown lands. A lot of the Crown lands are things where airports are and piers and places that bring in revenues. So the Office of Hawaiian Affairs gets a percentage of that on behalf of the Hawaiian people. And I think it would be very difficult to revert to a monarchy, but I think it's possible to have both, using the Crown lands as the monarchical lands, and then fee simple public lands for all the rest of us. I think it's possible. It will be a kind of a tough transition, though. However, we shall see. You're talking about the future. You would like that? You'd like, okay. I wish that they had taken pictures. They took a lot of pictures when they built this building, but that was in the 70s. If they'd only taken pictures, then we could say, for instance, when I take people through the attic upstairs, you can see where these long ohia beams have been cut. But I can't say that was from the move, even though I know it was, because they're cut and put back together and strapped. And that's how the house was moved. But I can't say that because nobody took any pictures. But they did cut the house in half, we do know that, and partially take it apart, and then move it on logs, roll it from the street out to the side of the road, because they knew the street was going to go up the hill. And it's pretty fascinating that they could do that. Basically a three-story house. I mean, they had the attic, the second floor, and the first floor. Yeah, cut it in half, move it. Okay. Yes, they could at the time. What do they call that? It's called, there's a word for it. It's kind of like public domain, but it's
Eminent domain?
eminent domain, yeah. And but back in that day, the government was much stronger than it is now. Now you have all kinds of processes to go through to have that happen. Mm-hmm. But back then they could just say, we're sending the street up the hill, so your house is getting out of there. That Hawaii is usually a very welcoming place. You've probably experienced that. People are very happy to help. The museum is a wonderful resource for things to see, for people to be able to see how things used to be, and especially when we finish our second floor, it's going to be wonderful. But we don't get enough coverage at the museum. The local people don't come too much, but when they're in fourth grade, they're here because it's part of their curriculum. But otherwise, I've had people come through and say, when I was in grammar school, I came to this museum, and I'm 50 years old, and now it's the first time I'm coming again. But the museum is a really great resource, and it just shows how Hawaii used to be for those who don't know.